But what we're going to talk about today is strength and conditioning, because this is something that has really risen, I would say, probably over the course of the last 20 years in boxing. You hear more and more about strength and conditioning. The science has improved, the knowledge has improved in all sorts of areas. And you look at fighters' physiques over those last couple of decades, and I'm not questioning fighters' fitness to fight prior to that, not at all, but fighters' physiques have changed. You look at them on the scales and they are different physical specimens now to how they used to be. And a lot of that, people would say, is down to strength and conditioning. And the perfect man for the job. We've got the perfect man for the job today, because he's, well, I was speaking to him before and I suggested he was a former MMA fighter, and he kind of wagged his finger and said, well, I don't know about that. I might not be quite done yet, but he's a professional fighter anyway. Now strength and conditioning coach to the stars, because he's got Macklin on his books. It's Chris Miah. Chris, thanks for doing this. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Looking forward to this, because it's, like I say, it's not something that I myself know all that much about. So I'll play the kind of layman role here. I mean, you could probably tell by just seeing me on camera, and this is kind of the view that Sky Sports viewers get whenever they do see me, which is usually fairly fleeting. Amazingly, I don't really do that much training myself, but I'm in astonishing nick. I mean, it just comes through the screen, doesn't it? It's just obvious. It's there to see. Were I to take this t-shirt off now, you would be blown away by it. But like I say, I don't really do all that much training. I'm just a naturally extraordinary physical specimen. That's not really true. I do a bit of training, but not, as much as I could be bothered to do, which quite frankly isn't all that much. So I am really genuinely interested to see what it is that you have to put yourselves through, specifically with regard to what it is that you do. So first of all, I mean, is that fair what I said there, that this is something that has really come to the fore in the last kind of 20 years? I'm guessing people have always been doing this, but it's become a separate entity, a kind of a thing of its own, certainly within what we work in boxing anyway.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that whereas in the older days, the boxing coach kind of was a jack of all trades, where they've done everything. They were the mental prep, the technical, the strength and conditioning, running, everything was all encompassed from the head coach. Whereas now I do see like boxers and mixed martial artists where they have a separate coach for all these entities: nutrition, psychology, strength and conditioning, and then their head boxing trainer. They have a manager, so that they've got all of these different individuals helping them nowadays, rather than just sort of like one guy overseeing everything.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. I mean, and there's a pro and a con for that. Like, I remember when I was training with Joe Gallagher, when I first went up there with him, Joe was a one-man band. Now, the good thing about that was he understood your whole week, because sometimes you can get with that. Because I've flirted with different strength and conditioners and different types of training over the years. Changed trainers several times, but sometimes when you've got a boxing trainer and he might be, working you hard in sparring, and he's got a plan for you, and then you're doing your own strength and conditioning on top of that, say on the night or the next day, and the next time you go back into the boxing gym, you're absolutely exhausted from the session you're done with the strength and conditioner, and the boxing trainer doesn't understand this because he's not a part of it, and all of a sudden you're throwing in sparring and you're getting your head punched off you, because really you should be either having a day off or having a very easy light session, just maybe focusing on skills and techniques. So the jack of all trade thing, yeah, I think, look, it's good to have expertise in every area, but I think it's good to have one person maybe running the ship that understands every part of it, which that's not always easy to get, because it's not always about expertise. Sometimes it's about egos as well. You've got this strength and conditioning guy might see it as his coming out party. He's got all this knowledge and this stuff he's worked on in strength and conditioning, but now he's aligned to a high profile professional fighter, and he sees this as his coming out party where he's going to establish his name and build his career on the back of this fighter. So he sees everything from a strength and conditioning point of view. He doesn't understand this guy might be absolutely, he might not be the greatest athlete in the world, but he's very clever. He's a natural born fighter, and he's ingrained, got that fighting fitness ingrained in him. He knows how to navigate his way through the rounds, and the strength and conditioning guy who's just seen it purely from a strength and conditioning athletic point of view. He's just, he's seen it. Everyone's seen it from their own different points of view. So it's for me, I always felt floating around, and this when I came along, Chris, I suppose, unfortunately, right at the end of my career, someone that has fought himself. He's not boxing, but MMA. He understands that there's the skill part. That he understands that the most important part is the fighting. That is the most important part. And all the sprints, all the hill runs, all the weight training, strength and conditioning, whatever, it's all to supplement your boxing. But over the years, from personal experience, I came across many strength and conditioning guys who thought that they could reinvent the wheel, and that doing this bench press or this squatting was going to make me necessarily a better fighter. No, it's going to make me a better athlete. And if I'm a better athlete, I can be a better fighter. But if we're doing so much strength and conditioning that it's taking over from the boxing, then it's not going to be beneficial. And I think, as you say there, Chris, back in the day, years ago, there was, of course, you were doing certain conditioning exercises, definitely, but they probably were a jack of all trades, and there were things that had been passed down to them from former, maybe their coaches or fighters they'd seen, and these things worked. They maybe didn't understand the science behind why it worked, but they could see that they worked. And also there was, we talk about it, me and you, Chris, and I've spoken to Andy as well. Sometimes you see boxing trainers doing certain things and they still winning their fights, but some of their methods, you could be on the outside looking in at them thinking, well, he done that. That must be a great thing to do. And you, as a sports scientist, studied it, fought it yourself, and think, nah, that was terrible training. He won his fights in spite of training like that, not because of. And me and Andy mentioned Enzo Macronelli, and we chatted, and I said, Enzo, you were going out running a 15-mile run, coming in, sparring, whatever. I said, just because you still won your fight, I can tell you now that was wrong. You won your fights in spite of that, not because of that. And it's a very important, maybe quite subtle, but an important thing to understand, because lots of fighters have achieved great things because they're great fighters. Not necessarily the way they got there, could have, and I would say if they'd done things differently, they would have been even better.
No, I agree. So, I agree with you, Matt. And I think even on that, the things that get passed down, so half of it's right, and even he's backed by science in this day. Things like I spoke to you about, like the longer road work, the jumping circuits that every amateur boxing gyms always give out works. We know the science why now, but it got passed down through generations, and it does work.
Mm. Yeah, and also in an amateur gym, you got to be honest, you're catering for, I don't know, 30, 40 kids. Everyone's different. You'll have some tall kids, you'll have some short, strong. Everyone's different. Obviously, as you progress then, and the ones that stick with it and go on professionally, training has to be catered for the individual. It's like, someone like Lomachenko, who's probably been doing gymnastics since he was a young kid. He's got those quick feet and everything. You might have someone then who's quite slow and strong and very predictable, but he can't half hit. You ain't going to see George Foreman, doing SAQs, stepping around his opponent. But he's a brute of a man, and if he hits you with a jab, he's going to knock you out the ring probably. You know what I mean? So it's everyone. So these are things that we're going to get into. Andy will steer the ship as always and pull me back when I go off on a mad tangent. But we'll, these are things that we want to talk about.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's start with basics, really. So what exactly, Chris, is strength and conditioning? I know there's a big clue in the name there, but I don't know exactly what it is in terms of the specific training that you would do. I've got an idea. So if you had to explain to somebody what it is that you are targeting and what it is that you're looking to try and achieve, how would you do it?
So the main role, in my opinion, of a strength and conditioning coach is essentially to guide the athlete to be able to do the sport more. Now, a lot of the things that come with that, then, whether it was being improving sort of work capacity or endurance, whether it be improving strength or power, it's essentially giving the athlete the capability to practice their sport more. In essence, you're building the capacity to be able to do that. Now, obviously, there's various different tools, methods in order to get that outcome. But like we said with Matt, actually becoming the best boxer you can be is the primary role of the S&C coach to support that training. Now, there may be things that we know by looking at sort of, if you were to take boxing, for example, we have things like needs analysis of what do all the successful boxers have? What if, there's data on what do the Olympic boxers have? What do professional boxers have at the elite level? What are their attributes? And we probably want to direct our training towards building those attributes in a fighter, whether that would be strength, power, speed, whatever those attributes may be. But we're just trying to complement the boxing training and keep them healthy as well. I mean, which is probably the most underappreciated aspect of strength and conditioning, is the ability to try and keep guys injury free. Boxers' shoulders, cores, the road work, it all takes its toll on your body and injury areas. So really our main job is to keep the boxer available, to make him strong and robust enough to do the vigors of the sport, and keep him available to be able to make his money, which is he needs to be healthy to be able to get his paydays and progress his career. And that should be our number one priority, is keeping the boxer healthy and able to do his sport. Number two then is we start improving the athlete as an athlete, where we're, like I say, we're improving strength, power, body composition, potentially moving them in weight classes along with a nutritionist, depending on how close or high they are to the weight class. So I always think that number one is making the boxer be available, healthy. Number two then is starting to improve some performance indicators.
So keeping the boxer healthy, it's one of those things where it's such an obvious thing to say that it's actually a really, really good point, because if you're able to train well and train consistently and not miss any days, and obviously that's all to the better. That's going to work out better for you. But Matt, by all means, chip in here. When you're training for boxing, it's always seemed to me from the outside looking in, and maybe this is wrong, and maybe this is something that you would say that people did in the past that they shouldn't do, but it's almost seemed to me that it's one of those processes, a specific camp, although these days people tend to stay more ready than they ever have been. But it almost seems to be a case of you need to kind of not break the athlete exactly, but you've got to put a real workload on them, break them down almost, and build them back up, because this is a brutal, hard, unforgiving thing that they're doing here, physically and mentally. You've got to really put them through it. Is that right or not?
So as a coach, I would always give the opinion of we do want to break them down and build them back up, but potentially over a longer period of time, to build up over time, rather than being so intensive and absolutely running them into the ground straight away. But I do understand as a fighter that...
Chris, let's interrupt quickly. When you say over a period of time, you're talking years, aren't you, as opposed to 12 weeks? Like, absolutely
years. Like, if you were to look, even on a rough example, if you were to look at, I don't know, a running workout or a weightlifting workout of a boxer who has a high training age, who's trained for 5 or 6 years, and you'd look and go, that's really difficult, but they've progressively built up to that over time. If you were to jump in the deep end and try out of the blue, you'd be crushed. So I think that's important. But I understand what Andy's saying in terms of to feel, and you know this, Matt, we've spoke about it, but to feel mentally prepared to fight, you feel like you have to have gone in the trenches and worked so hard and ran yourself into the ground, which is, I feel like that has a bigger influence on psychology than sort of the actual physiological changes that you're getting from such training. Like the benefit might not be physiological as in to the changes that happen to your body, but it may be more that mentally you feel very robust, soundly going into a fight, that you're willing to walk through anything.
There's a massive mental aspect to sport, to boxing, to all sports. I think particularly to boxing, because it's man to man, isn't it? It's the ultimate kind of level of competition, if you like, and you go to some dark places during that fight, and there's an element of, mental toughness, to solitude, to breaking pain barriers and all that type of stuff. So there's a place, you know, listen, Rocky IV, everyone loves that movie. He's down, he's in the mountains, he's running up the mountain in the snow. You know what I mean? But the reality is, and I was that guy that used to kind of balloon in between fights, wouldn't do any training, and then would go away, and I'd be in the camp mentality for 10, 12 weeks, solitude, getting up, training twice a day, eating, you know, shredding myself, all that sort of stuff. But then, you know, what had happened is, but by the time the fight had come, I was so deprived of living a normal life for so long that I completely went from yin to yang and overindulged, you know, and, you know, then there was nothing in between. There were two extremes. I think that letting yourself go and having the faith in strength and conditioning, and think, no, I've got to weigh into a camp and I've got to put myself through that pain and put myself through that solitude and build that mental toughness and get that eye of the tiger. Yes and no, because you've got to be careful on the flip side of that. Like strength and conditioning, you know, like I say, it's something I did myself in different ways in my career, with different trainers, different times, did lots of strength and conditioning, did no strength and conditioning, did a little bit. Now, I've been doing a lot of training since lockdown when we were able to in the gym, and I got myself in good shape, and we were doing a lot of lifting and weight training and stuff. Now, and I've had this conversation with you, Chris, and I respect your opinion because you fought. You're not a strength and conditioning guy that's just coming with the theory. You understand how it incorporates into the rest of the week of your training and at different stages of where you're at in terms of weeks out from a fight. Now, I'm very much like I say, I was that no training, then 10, 12 weeks mental training. But now I'm very much on the mindset of, as you said, it's more a case of consistency and than big workouts. And I actually think that probably the strength and conditioning is kind of your all year round for the whole remainder of your career. It's all year round, as opposed to actually when you get into those last few weeks before your fight, because the boxing training is really cranked up a notch in terms of the intensity where you're sparring and the pad work, let's say, actually the strength and conditioning really goes on the back burner then. Instead of cranking that up, that should be when it kind of goes, maybe you do one a week just to kind of maintain. But I would argue, and see what you think, Chris, but I would argue that actually those kind of last 4 or 5 weeks, really, when the boxing training and the sparring starts, the strength and conditioning either goes completely or, you do maybe one session a week on the weekend just to kind of maintain. You just hit every body part with a couple of sets and you leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, even in terms of strength and conditioning, in terms of programming, we talked about before, like periodization of just a plan of when we do what. And the closer to competition you get, the more specific your preparation becomes. So in the terms of conditioning, like you say, your intensity of sparring is usually higher around a fight. Your intensity of pad work is higher. So we've got to take that into account. Now, I would keep in lifting at a reasonable intensity, or lifting, jumping, throws, all of what we would consider traditional strength conditioning. The intensity would be quite high, but the volume would be way, way, way lower than what you would do 12 weeks out from a fight, because the bulk of your time is on what your job at hand is on competing, and is on specific preparation. It's kind of like how many guys.
And 12 weeks out, that's not so important. You might not even know who you're fighting at that point. So really, that's when you can work on power. That's when you can work on strength.
And I think it's very like the further out you are, the more general you're training, even to the point of like runs and things like that. Very general. But when you get right near fight night, the bulk of your effort should be on your technical preparation on the pads with your head coach, your sparring rounds, and yes, we still want to keep the adaptations, which is just the changes we make to our body, but through a training camp. But what you tend to find, a lot of the good adaptations we get from a good training program last quite a bit of time. That they have a residual effect, which means they last. So things like strength, aerobic endurance, things of that nature have quite a long residual, as in you can stop training them and they will last 20, 30 days. So what that lets us do is put, especially around fight night, put a lot of our time into the speed, into that sharpness that we want to get on the pads, in sparring. And you know yourself, like you're quite fit at the moment, but if you went and sparred a guy, you'd be very, very tired because it's a different fitness. So it's, running fitness and just having a good heart rate is general fitness. But you know yourself, when you do pads or you spar, even in particular, if you're not used to that specific fitness, you get your gas, you're tired.
Yeah.
So let's get into some specifics then, because Matt made the Rocky analogy there. We end up making Rocky analogies a lot on Macklin's take, but because there's truth behind them, they do apply, they're relevant. And Rocky against Ivan Drago in Rocky 4, what you've got there is the clash of old school versus new school. Rocky's doing it in big army boots. It's about pain and discomfort and willpower, running up mountains. Body weight training basically is what he's doing there, really. Drago's in this space age kind of sports institute before people really had them, using machines. And the message there really is that Rocky won that fight because he did that hard, gritty, put yourself through it, put up with the discomfort, and he wanted it more than Drago, because his conditions were kind of easier, were kind of simpler. I mean, that's old school and new school are two phrases you hear a lot when you come to talk about training. And we spoke to Frotch a while ago on the podcast, and he's a bit of a go-to for me as well, because he described himself as being old school with regard to his training. He said, I ran, I sparred, I did pull-ups, sit-ups, dips, press-ups, and I believed in myself. And obviously that last one is massive. But let's say if someone came to you and said, that's what I do for my training, that Frotch regime, that's what I do, what would you say to them? Okay, that's great, but here's other stuff that we need to do. You need to do more than that.
Yeah, I think this is what I would do now. I've obviously made the mistakes in the past in terms of you try to change everything, or because there's different philosophies of training, different philosophies of from boxing coaches to S&C coaches. But I would try and sit down with the fighter and their head boxing coach and see what they do, because clearly it's working for a lot of guys, but potentially make small changes and over time educate them why that might be a good idea. And I think that's what it comes down to, for what our guys need to do in terms of S&C or sports scientists is to try and educate the boxers and their trainers as to why these might be good ideas. And to be honest, like what you've just said, Frotch does, they'd probably do all that within an S&C plan on top of other things as well. So it's not a case of either or. Do I think boxers should be doing push-ups, pull-ups? Should they be running? Should they be doing core work? Should they be throwing things? Absolutely. It's just potentially in what volumes, and adding in some other little things that may help their overall training program. But I think it's one of those new school and old school, and they're more similar than you think. Doing a pull-up or doing a machine pull-down, you're almost working very similar movements, give or take. So they're both creating overload. They're the same thing in that token. So although we look at it as like, well, doing these bodyweight calisthenics is really old school, push-ups, dips, pull-ups of that nature. But maybe, and people tend to associate S&C, especially from the Rocky 4 film, as machines and bodybuilding, and Matt can probably attest to this, that like the Kerry Kay's days, a lot of it was bodybuilding, and I think that's what S&C gets looked upon because of the popularity of bodybuilding magazines and people we associate as big strong men. We associate as these muscle bound physiques we see on cover magazines. But in the same token, if you actually look at strength and conditioning, rugby players, Olympic lifters, you'll see like little Chinese Olympic lifters, females that can lift more than me and Matt combined, and they're not big and bulky. So I think it's almost educating the community about what strength and conditioning is, because there's probably more similarities than differences between the old school and new school.